We're recording now.
Uh, yeah, good enough. Excuse me here. It's been a long day, and it's gonna get even longer because I got to work tonight, and I don't want to. Anyway, so welcome to 3D print finishing with me, the most irritating voice in all of Epcot. Good job. Um, so the last class was just a general overview of 3D printing as a whole subject. So this one's going to specifically focus on finishing. My goal with this class is to help dismiss some of the stigma that a lot of people have with what happens after the print leaves the printer. A lot of people seem to think that the printer does all the work. You put it on, you pull it off the printer, and you slap some paint on it and put it out there to be judged, and that is most definitely not the case. Once you take your printer off the printer, no matter how many hours it takes, actually, let me reset that. If you have an FDM printer, this class is going to dismiss some of that stigma. If you have an SLA or what is known as a resin printer, it will dismiss a little bit, but not as much. The reason being is because FDM printers are layer by layer additives, the same as SLA, but it's a solid plastic filament string that gets melted and then fused into place. So you have layer lines, which I did touch on in my last class. With resin printers, it is also additive printing, but you're dipping it in liquid, curing that, and then pulling it up, and then doing it over and over and over again so it builds layer by layer, but the layer lines are much closer together. So sanding is not required as much on a resin printer print than it would be on a FDM printer. So with that being said, I'm going to specifically speak on finishing FDM prints today because I don't have a resin printer, and I forgot to ask a friend of mine who's actually in the chat, forgot to ask him to print me out a large flat piece so I could show how that looks when it gets finished. That's my fault, sorry. So with that being said, this is a Hobgoblin mask. This is not a design that I made. This is a design that I pulled off of Thingiverse, and I did that for a reason. All the settings were in place when I downloaded the design. All I had to do is plug them in and hit print and let it go. So I don't know if you can see the layer lines. Should be able to, because I can see them on my camera, but right there, kind of looks like pencil lines on the helmet or on the mask. Yeah, those are layer lines. And then on this end, you can see them a little better, but they're white because I spent some time sanding. So you can see a difference before and after. And then you'll see the transition to during in this. First most important thing you need to figure out when you're going to do the finishing is which type of finishing you're going to do. I prefer sanding, mainly because I like to get a feel for the project as I'm working on it. A lot of people use what's called resin finishing, where they take either craft resin or UV resin and they spread it on in really thin layers. And then they either set it out in the sun or they set it under a UV lamp or on a turntable or in a curing box or whatever. Both of those are great. It just doesn't give me the tactile sensation of actually finishing a project that I enjoy. So for me, sandpaper and muscle fatigue. This is an 80 grit sandpaper. Yeah, it's readable. Okay, good. So basically, what you're going to do is you're going to tear off a piece. I use 80 grit. Some people start with 60 grit. Other people start with a slower grit. Some people do it by hand. I actually do it by hand, and I use a random orbit sander for large surfaces like this. I would normally do with a random orbit sander, but that's loud and you will not be able to hear me. So hand sanding it is. And basically all you do is apply just enough pressure to hold it in place. Get a little closer. just enough pressure to hold it in place, and we go across the layer line. So these layer lines go this way. So what you're going to do is you're going to sand across the layer lines. Because if you sand it with the layer line, and I think I touched on this in my last class. Yeah, right there. You can see where it's sanding, but it's not removing the lines. But if you go across the layer lines, it does take a few extra passes to get the finish. But as you can see, going across the layer lines, you don't see as many layer lines. Like the deeper ones, like that one there and this one right here, are still there. It's going to take some more sanding. But going across the layer lines, you've pretty much wiped out 95% of the actual layer lines that are present. If you look over here or down in this area, you can see the transition like straight along this line here. Normally what I do is I start with 80 grit. So that's that. And then I move to 120. Let us say 150 for a second. 80, 120, 200, 320, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200, 15, 2,000. And if I really, really, really wanted to be baby's butt smooth, I would go all the way up to 2,500. That's before painting. The other way to finish this, the resin printing, like I said, you coat it with resin, you leave it with UV resin, you would either leave it outside or in a UV box. With craft resin, you would cover it in a thin layer, and then you would wait for it to gel to start to kick over and cure. So it would gel up, probably take about 4 or 5 hours. And then you would put on another layer. So you would do 2 really, really, really thin layers and let those cure overnight, which would start after the second layer was put on. So it'd be at least 12 to 18 hours. And then you would put on a third layer once that layer is completely cured, or once those first 2 layers are cured, you do a third layer and you would let that one dry. It would take about 2 to 2.5 days doing it with craft resin. But you would have a nearly smooth finish and only the deepest of layer lines would still be showing through. After that, you would sand it to knock out just to knock off the high spots and things, to get it to be one uniform surface. I would not recommend it for a mask like this because, as you can see, it's got the eyebrows and the expression in it. Resin curing would remove that entirely. For things like helmets, can you bring me, Brush, can you bring me yeah, that one. Sorry, not very well prepared. But for helmets, like this one, okay, don't fall. But for helmets like this one, this is where I would use something like a resin cure. That would go, because these are all flat areas that you don't have to worry about removing a lot of detail. Now up here, I would not do a resin cure, mainly because it would fill in those lines and it wouldn't make that look flat more often than not. But everywhere else, I most definitely would resin cure because of them being wide, flat areas with very little detail. I don't have to worry about losing any detail, and it would speed up the process exponentially. It would take longer, but it would require a lot less sanding, and sanding takes longer than resin curing. Trust me, I know from experience. To finish that helmet alone, or that mask, the Hobgoblin mask, I am going to have to put in an additional 62 hours of sanding, and that's before I even get to paint. Once I start painting it, it'll be an additional 48 after that, so about 120 hours worth of sanding, including the paint job. for this one to get it where it is right now with resin curing minus cure times, it took me about 55 hours of sanding. And that is with both hand sanding and the random orbit sander, because there are some areas like up at the top in here that are just the sander will just not fit. So you have to do it by hand. But it was still about 55 hours. With a complete resin cure that is a completely flat helmet, say like a Deadpool or a Red Hood, would probably take me about 48 to 50 hours, but that includes the cure time. I'm sorry, that includes the cure time of the resin. So the flatter the helmet, the bigger the space that you need to cover, the more likely it would be that I, in my expertise, would advocate for resin cure. For small intricate pieces or pieces that have a lot of detail, that are just surface detail that you don't want to lose, hand sanding is pretty much the only way you're going to be able to keep all of that. So unfortunately, you're going to have to do it by hand. You can't even use a machine because the machine will also spin too fast and take out your details. Move this other way. Once you're done with your, I know I'm moving kind of fast, so if at any point in time you guys have any questions or you need me to expand on something, either raise your hand or interrupt me, unmute your microphone, and say, hey, excuse me, stop for a second, or something like that, because I'm going to move through this as quickly as I can and then double back for questions. But some of you may have questions that need to be clarified immediately. So feel free to speak up if that be the case.
Send Rush to go grab your Mini, because I didn't do anything but hit it with a primer coat after I broke all the sprues and shit off. That way you can see the difference.
Can you reach into my my book for D&D and grab me one of the 2 minis? Or actually grab them both. I forgot all about the resin minis, dude.
I actually just had gone digging and I was like, wait, he's got 2 that I printed for him.
Yeah, but I actually meant to have you print me out just a flat sheet, but not along the build plate. Like actually print me out a sheet, say like, yeah, paper.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, but you should be able to see it on there if there are any.
Yeah. So let's see if this focuses. Oh, look, it's not going to focus on. There you go. So in here, you can see it looks. Let's see if I can turn this. There we go. Much better. Oh, you're going to be a jerk today. All right. So on the flat parts of the robes for this, you can see what I was talking about with resin printing. So this was done on, I'm going to say it's an Ole Mars. Resin print.
Or no, Anycubic.
Anycubic photon. Okay, so it's an Anycubic photon resin. It's an SLA or resin printer. It's printed basically like this, and it goes down into the resin. Whatever layer it's on, those specific lights light up, and then it pulls up, and it just repeatedly does that until it builds up to what you see here. Flip it over, pop it off, bam, there you go. That is a cured mini that has just been primered, does not have any sanding or anything done to it. Obviously, with it being as small as it is, you could only barely sand it anyway, because most of the detail on here is larger than the pad of a finger. So there you go. This one's a little better to see the front. If I could hold on to it. That way you can see the detail goes all the way around, even in the facial area. You know what? How you like me now? Yeah, do what I tell you to do. Yes, I talk to my phone when it doesn't work the way I want it to. But so after moving on from the sanding by hand, after you're done with sanding, you're going to paint it. And essentially anybody who has seen or done or researched automotive bodywork, the process is literally going to be exactly the same, minus the Bondo part, because the Bondo part is covered by the printer actually printing the piece that you are finishing to paint. So you've got the Bondo, you've got everything smooth and everything, you're ready for paint. First thing you're gonna do is you're gonna prime your piece, but unlike paint or unlike bodywork on a vehicle, you are not going to prime it and then lightly sand it just to rough it up, because primer generally lays pretty flat. Unless you get like what's called the high build primer, which is not that. That's high build is one type. It's actually called filler primer. This is what's called sandable filler primer. It's not as high build, but it also does fill in some of the gaps and mistakes, some small mistakes that you make. And then there is straight sandable primer, which just builds up a layer, covers everything, and then you got to sand out all the high spots. When you're doing 3D printing, you're going to prime your piece, and then you're going to sand it so that all of everything but the lowest of the low spots are visible with paint in them. You're going to do that layer by layer of primer until you are only sanding off that top layer of primer. Like when you start to sand it, if you don't put any pressure on it and just use your 120 grit or 200 grit sandpaper, depending on which you prefer, you're not pulling off a ton of paint, and you're not saying, say, for this one, the red. So like here, if I wanted to take all of this detail out, I would prime this until I didn't see any of the red on a spot like this, because this is the highest point. Once you do that, you prime the entire piece one last time. You give it a very, very light sanding with your highest grit sandpaper. I recommend probably about 400 grit. And then you're on to paint. Once you get to paint, that's when the joy and hatred of sanding begins. And I'll show you. So this piece is a Godzilla helmet. I made it for the premiere of the Godzilla vs. Kong movie. Yes, I'm that level of nerdy. It's okay. As you can see in the front, it is not very smooth on his nose, but that's because I want the Godzilla skin texture to be prevalent in the helmet itself, which you can see like in this area here, and in the eyebrows or the cheek ridge, and then in the neck cover and somewhere in the jawline. It's a lot more prevalent on the top, mainly because, like I said, I wanted that Godzilla skin texture to show through the paint once I'm done painting it. This piece, this is literally the first coat of paint. I've done the primer, and I've done all of the sanding for the primer. Almost lost the helmet. Excuse me while I fix that. So this is the first coat of paint, and it has been sanded up. Actually, no, it has not been sanded. I've not done any sanding on this at all. Mainly because this was actually just supposed to be an accent coat, and it was only supposed to be on the high spots, but I like the way it looks so much that I decided to paint the whole thing. So when you're finished, when you're going to do finishing work, once you hit paint, you're going to start at 400 grit. Anything else would just snatch all of the paint off of your project, and you'd have to start over, which would defeat the purpose of your first layer of paint. And you're going to tear off a much smaller piece. So this would be to get ready for paint. This would be to sand the paint, because you're going to want to get into the detail pieces, like the little divot inside between the nose, but you don't want to rip the paint off of here. You definitely want to get in here and keep it an even what's the word I'm looking, an even sanding. So what you're going to do is, and you're going to want to do it. So for the flat pieces like this, or flat sections like this, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use very tight circles. Reason being is because if you go up and down or left and right, you're going to leave sanding lines and scratches. So you're going to treat your hand as if it's a random orbit sander. And you're going to go in really tight circles across the area. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to scuff up the paint on the very high spots, which if you did your finishing work the way on like as you saw on the other helmet, the Lubu Reaper helmet, if you did it that way, then that would be perfectly smooth and you wouldn't have any high spots because you want it to look like finished metal. This one does not. But so like I said, tight circles. And for something like this, you're going to be looking to see that the paint comes off of the high spots and just the high spots. Turn this toward the light and grab the helmet. So this is what it looks like when it hasn't been sanded at all. And see where it's got the black and then the inside, there's still the copper, the beaten copper look. So these high spots, they feel flat, but they're very clearly visibly not. So what you're going to do in that situation is you're going to go over the entire piece with 400 grit sandpaper. At this point, that is where your sanding nightmare is going to get a little easier, but also become a much worse nightmare. 400 grit sandpaper is the lowest grit that I will use to dry sand. Dry sanding is basically what you see woodworkers do. They take some sandpaper, they slap it on the part, they move it around. And you get a lot of dust and debris and everything, and everybody comes out looking like they've tap danced through a granary. It's a big mess. After 400 grit, I'm going to do what's called wet sanding. I'm sorry, at 400 grit, I'm going to do something called wet sanding. And what that is when you take your 400 grit sandpaper, you're going to do one pass as dry sanding, and then you're going to do one pass with wet sanding. 400 grit sandpaper, dip it in water, let the water drip off. Make sure you get your sandpaper nice and wet. This is before you paint your second coat, because from this point forward, you're only going to be wet sanding and your grits are going to get higher. So 400 grit sandpaper, dip it in water, shake off all the excess. And then again, you're going to go in really tight circles, but you're going to notice a difference this time. When you go in a really, really, really tight circles, all of the dust and debris and paint peeling off that you've had in the, when you did the 400 grit dry sanding is going to be gone. It's actually not going to be there. And the reason for that is, well, water makes things stick together. So now, turn it toward the light and show you a close-up on the phone. So now it looks like you've pulled off all the paint, but it's all sanding dust that is wet. See? That's all on my fingers now. So that's why I said wet sanding is going to make your sanding better, but it's also going to make your sanding nightmare a little bit worse. Because all the dust and debris, you don't have to worry about it. You don't need to use an inhaler, or not an inhaler, respirator or a mask or any of that when you're doing wet sanding that you would for dry sanding. Mainly because there's not a whole lot of dust, if any. Now, some people prefer to alternate back and forth between wet and dry. That's usually done and creating a lot of unnecessary work for themselves. I don't recommend it, especially if you're trying to do something quickly. Towel. Every time you change grits, every time you make a pass over the helmet, every time you need to check, you're going to wipe the helmet clean. Now, I made a mistake because I pressed too hard. as you can see, where you can see the red and the white, yeah, I sanded through my primer coat. Again, I wanted to keep that texture from the Godzilla, or for the Godzilla hide, but I have now sanded this part till it's mostly smooth, like especially right in here. It's literally pretty smooth. Over here, I've still got some texture and around there, but in where these lines meet up, this Y, and then right in front of it, it's pretty smooth. So that one, when I repaint it, it's going to look less natural and more synthetic, which is a look I didn't want. But what better way to show you how what mistakes look like than I make them so you don't have to. For wet sanding, it's 400, 800, 1,000, 1,200. After 1,200 or 1,500, depending on how high you want to go. Everything else is completely optional. After 15 or at 1,500, your piece should be as smooth as you would necessarily want it to present it for, say, if you were doing something for Dragon Master. Or if you were doing a piece for a commission and the guy said he wanted it to look like actual metal. I, however, prefer to go all the way up to 2,500 because if it's going to look like metal, I want it to feel like metal, and I want it to have that smooth, slick texture. But that's just me. Like I said, I kind of do this for a living, so my QA standards are going to be much different than someone else's. It's also probably why I won't be judging any 3D printed pieces in any Dragon Master, because I am a stickler for details, and I would ask so many questions that we would have to put a hold on Dragon Master. So, with that being said, we'll move back to the other helmet. So this one, as you can see, has been sanded in some places. I'm still working on it, and then other places have not. And that is because I had to do repair work. Repair work is very often, Russ, bring me the Godzilla God, please. Repair work is quite often the bane of a modeler's or a 3D print maker's existence. This is one way of doing repair work, which I use JB Weld and a for sale sign, cut out a piece, because right across here is a little bitty line that I tried to fill with craft resin, and it did not work. So I stuck the for sale sign on it, and JB welded it in place. So this is now probably the strongest part of it. I would not drop it though. Now, this piece is completely unfinished. This is fresh off the printer. I had to print this in 2 pieces. It is a top and a bottom. And right there is the seam line. It goes all the way around. It was too tall for my printer. So, 3D print repair. Option 2, filament welding. Probably the easiest and the most irritating way to do it. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your seams together. You're going to line them up. And then you're going to take a 3D print pen, or you can take some filament and a woodworker's tool, wood burning tool. Sorry, not woodworkers, because that's very different. You can use some filament and a wood burner's tool. You can use a hot spoon. You can use a hot clay knife. You can use pretty much anything that has a flat surface that you can heat up safely and press the filament in place. I use a 3D print pen because I found one for $12, Ziltech.com. No, this is not an advertisement. They're not going to see this. But yeah, they sell them for about $12. Heats up PLA to about, well, I've gotten mine set for 210 degrees, which is 5 degrees hotter than my 3D printer is set, which is 205. Basically, you're going to, same as that. I'll just use these for reference. So say here's your seam line. You're going to stick the 3D print pen up against your seam line, and you're going to go forward. You're not going to go backwards. If you go backwards, you'll leave a bead bulging out of the top, and that'll just make sanding that much harder. What you're going to do is you're actually going to, instead of having it this way and pulling backwards, you're going to have it this way, and you're going to push forward. That's going to push the filament into the seam and fill any gaps that you may have. Once that's done, you're going to go back over it backwards and then over it forwards again. You're going to do it in very small sections. I'd say work no more than 4 or 5 inches at a time. Reason being is because if you mess up here, you're going to stop and you're going to fix that problem. But if you're working a line that is this long and you mess up here and you continue, that mistake is going to creep all the way through. And that's a lot more work to fix. That's why I said it's easier, but it's also more annoying, because the fact that it's easier means they tend to pay less attention to what they're doing and thereby making more mistakes. Case in point, I was watching television while I was trying to do this. So as you can see right here, there you go, where it's bulged out, but it looks like it's pushed in. Yeah, that is actually the bottom of the top section of the thigh. I pushed in the bottom section too far and created a ridge for myself. So now I have to fill it and sand it Bondo style, which is, like I said, I'd rather I make the mistakes and you see what happens than you make them and have to start over and waste $60 worth of filament. Plus your repairs and all that stuff. At this point, I'm going to stop for a second and give you guys a chance to ask any questions you may have about what I just talked about, because I know that was a lot of information. So if anybody has any questions, now's the time. No one? Huh, okay. I will continue. Where was that? Oh, finishing and 3D printing and using the print pen. The other way you can do it is JB Weld or super glue, which I don't recommend super glue because super glue doesn't melt. It does not actually melt the plastic together. It used to, but it doesn't anymore. Don't recommend PVC glue because that is too harsh. It will melt the plastic much more than you need to, and you'll end up with this mushy, squishy middle that is weak. And no matter how much you fill it, the second somebody presses on it, it will cave in on itself. I don't recommend silicone because it's stretchy and soft and it never actually hardens completely. So again, squishy part, likely to fall apart. And also nothing sticks to silicone but other silicone. So bad idea. As far as adhesives go, my go-to is JB Weld if I have to glue 2 pieces together, as you saw with the inside of the Lubu helmet. I forgot where I was actually going with that. Oh, yeah. So in summation for the beginning, finishing before painting, make sure all your gaps are filled. Make sure all of your layer lines are sanded smooth. Make sure all your gaps are filled. Make sure you have done all of your sanding and smoothing up to 400 grit. You can go higher. I do. I mean, you don't have to. 400 will leave scratches and you know, even if you do it as a in the tight circles that I described, it still has a chance to leaving layer lines because 400 grit is it's still kind of a pretty stout grit of sandpaper. It does go into the more polishing range, especially once you start wet sanding. So once you get to that point, if you want to go past 400, I do it because it's kind of meditative for me and it helps with a lot of things. Like if I got something I'm trying to figure out, the repetitive, I can zone out and just blow through a piece in 2 or 3 hours, or through a section in 2 or 3 hours, and then go back to the thing I was actually working on. Oh, that's what I need to do. Talking a lot, get nervous, cigarettes help. Once you get to wet sanding, start at 400. For 400 up to 1500, you can actually skip 600 and go from 4 to 8 if you've done a really good job on the 400 grit. After 1500, you're basically just polishing your top layer of paint, and you can achieve that same effect with gloss coat or matte coat, top coat paints. You can use rattle cans. If you are going to use rattle cans for your top coats, make sure that you do not use a can in a temperature that is less than 75 degrees. Reason being is the can itself may be 75 degrees. You can heat up the can. You absolutely can. Got to be careful, but you can do it. You can heat up the can to 75 degrees. Warm water, wait probably about 5-10 minutes. Shake the can every 2 or 3 minutes to help, disperse the warmth, and it's fine. The air in the area where you are painting is more important. That is because a 75-degree can sprayed into a 65-degree room drops the paint temperature down by about 2 degrees per inch. And you have to hold the can at least 6 inches away to get an even, smooth coat. Trust me, I have done the math and I have tested this extensively. 6 feet minimum, or 6 inches minimum. So when you do your top, now you can paint in 65, 50 degree weather. I wouldn't, because then you have the chance of your paint looking gloppy and you have to do more sanding to get it smooth. But it is possible to do so. If you have a heated paint booth, this does not become a problem at all. If you, like today is 78 degrees, almost 80. So spray painting, this would be the day that I would be doing spray painting, but I don't have anything that is ready for top coats or the next coat of paint currently at this time. Let's see what else. See, paint coverage. Oh, paint coverage. When you're painting something that is 3D printed, your first 3 coats should be light. Not light as in thin spray coats. I mean light as in a lighter color. The reason being is because a darker color will hide mistakes. A lighter color will expose them, and it will expose them with glaring visuality. I don't even think that's a word, but it is today. The reason why you want to use lighter colors at first is because if your first coats are smooth, then your top coats will be smooth and look that much better. If you leave a mistake for finishing and you get to your top coats, that mistake will stand out. It will literally be paint will act as a magnifying glass for that single solitary mistake. And if you're a perfectionist as I am, then you will dip it in a bottle of, or in a bucket of Crud Cutter, remove all of the paint and start over. And I don't think you want to do that. You really don't, because that's 40 to 50 hours wasted, and you're going to kick yourself every second of having to redo it. So for painting, do a coat, start 400, sand it, sand it lightly, knock down all the high spots. Second coat, do the same thing. Third coat, do the same thing. The lighter color, the better. I usually use white for the first couple of coats. Then after that, I go over it again. If, say, for the Godzilla helmet, Godzilla is very dark creature, so I wanted the helmet to reflect that dark tone that Godzilla has throughout his body. So I used a black primer after using a white primer, once I got it smooth to the effect that I wanted to see through my top coats. You are still going to be sanding between coats. And before you put on your finish coats, your clear coats, you're going to sand it one final time. And then you're going to leave it to sit for a day, or at least overnight. Reason being is eye fatigue. You're going to get tired of staring at this, so you're going to miss things. The longer you do sanding, the more hours you put in, the more likely you are to miss something or to want to rush the project. And that's where you're going to make mistakes. And those mistakes will be shown in your finish coats, and you will hate it again. Some people will hate it very little, but if it's going to be a piece that you're going to have displayed, say in a costume contest, or you are selling it to someone and they want a perfect piece, you're not going to want to send it to them. When you do your top coat, you're going to do 2 very thin coats, sand those. They're going to go opaque. Once the entire helmet is opaque, looks dusty, you're going to wipe it off with a wet rag, and you're going to wet sand your top coats. You're not going to dry sand at all. Dry sand, you're going to rip the paint completely off. You're going to wet sand. The water somehow, I don't understand the science behind it, so I'm not even going to try to explain it, but the water will help you, A, not rip off the top coats, and B, not have as much with the dust and everything. It will help the paint stick and stay on the piece. With either your gloss coat or your matte coat, your clear coats to top, you're going to sand those till it looks opaque, each one, and then you're going to do an entire coat, again, a third coat, and that one you are not going to sand at all. That is going to be your finish coat, and that one I recommend you do a thin coat, then you wait an hour or two, do another thin coat, and then another hour or two to wait, and then you do a third top coat. That should be your finish coat. You're completely done. It's all painted. These are just to get it to the visual that you want, whether it's a shiny metal or dark, like a skin tone, or a more organic feature. Once you finish that top coat, you're going to leave it sit for no less than 24 hours. I recommend putting it somewhere inside something, like inside your garage or inside of a room where you can cover it with a box and it not be disturbed by anything. Cats, dogs, no stray dust can land on it or anything like that. Let that coat sit for, like I said, no less than 24 hours. That'll give it time to completely cure, and then when you cover it with the box, make sure the box is big enough so it doesn't touch anything. Leave it set 24 hours, lift the box straight up, and it should be done and dusted and ready to go out the door. When you're painting, if you have a paint booth, this will not be much of an issue, but if you don't have a paint booth, you need to pay attention to everything that is in the air. Dust, animal hair. I do a lot of my spray painting outside, so grass being blown. This is West Texas. The wind does get high. So grass being blown around or dirt being blown around, bugs, anything like that, those will mess up your paint job. I had a helmet which has since been, oh, actually, this one is actually ready for top coats. It's a different helmet than the other one. The other one had ears. This one is my personal mask for AmpGuard for a persona change that I'm about to undergo. But you can see here where it's got scratches. It looks like scratches, but it's not. I was not paying attention when I painted it, and I hit it with the top coat, the metallic top coat. And when I went in, I left it outside to cure because it was a bright sunny day, and I figured it would, wouldn't be an issue. Came outside and there were 2 or 3 pieces of grass that were stuck to the helmet, so I had to pull those off. But at that point, when I noticed it, the paint had already cured and had already dried because I use a rattle can for this. So it had dried, and I had to actually peel the pieces of grass out of the paint and then resand those that little area, which of course means that then I had to resand the entire helmet so I could keep the coats even. Or the entire mask, sorry. Mask, helmet, they're kind of interchangeable. But this one is actually ready for the next stage of painting, in which I will do all the detail on the smile and the weathering and everything else along to bring out these ridges and everything to give it that organic facial texture. I think at this point, that's pretty much all I need to talk about. I know it's a lot to listen to, so we have about 13 minutes left in the class. So if there's any questions, or if you guys, I know Rob is here, Redbeard. He does resin printing pretty much exclusively, and he's gotten pretty good at it. And he also has gotten pretty good at painting and finishing his miniatures. So Rob, if you would like to add anything to this as far as resin print finishing goes, or if you guys have any questions, the floor is yours. Speak up if you want.
I will go ahead and stop recording.